If Gary hadn't come home, he could be dead.
Don't be stingy. Start the conversation with something like this. I just sat down.
Sorry, but honestly, if Gary hadn't come home, this episode of SpongeBob would have become the most disturbing one in the whole series. Even more disturbing than when SpongeBob mutilated his body for his Halloween costume. So, if you're ready to learn the tragedy behind this episode, get ready because things are about to get really crazy. Let's start by recalling a bit of the episode. Bob Esponja had to feed Gary because he was out of food, but just as he arrived, a racket hit him. Special edition of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, made by Nickelodeon Incorporated. Fun fact, Nickelodeon was under the sea. And what if you had already noticed this detail before? Did you win some eggs with ham and cookies?
Oh, that's delicious, Mamon.
In this racket game comes the Dirty Bubble Challenge, which consists of hitting ball A.
29,998,559,671,349 times in a row, and
even though it sounds extreme, according to Patrick, he actually did it, but he lost his trophy. Ah, what an idiot. That's why I love him for being such an idiot. And then Sponge wants to complete the challenge, so he throws Gary as if he were an opossum. Wait, I know this has nothing to do with the video, but is this challenge actually possible? Supposedly it is, because remember that Patrick said he actually did it. So, how long would Gary have gone without eating while SpongeBob was completing the challenge? The truth is, if we calculate that SpongeBob saw 3 hits to the ball per second in total, it would take him a while. 317,192 years. And without stopping. So, I think Patricio just imagined it. Patricio, you're always so spaced out. You're lost without me.
What's up, Luisito? How are you?
Good. Drunk and high, Gary gets fed up and decides to leave to look for a home where he is actually wanted. So he takes the Caracolian route bus, and on his way he runs into the grandma, who mistakes him for Miss Tootsie. From there, she feeds Gary as if she were going to eat him for Christmas, so that later SpongeBob goes looking for him. He gets so depressed and becomes emo. But then Gary comes back home. Alright, very nice story, but let's change it a bit. How about that? And for some reason or another, what if Gary hadn't come back? The truth is, my friends, no matter how you look at it, the story would get very, very tragic. Let's start with SpongeBob's side. Back then, SpongeBob felt completely guilty for wanting to spend those 300,000 years doing the Dirty Bubble Challenge and leaving Gary waiting without eating. As we saw, he was very, very sad and did everything he could to get attention and find him. But would Bob ever get so depressed that he would let himself die? Would he lose his job at the Krusty Krab? Wow, this sounds like a creepypasta, but it's actually not. Friends? Even though it seemed like Bob would be deeply depressed after losing Gary, the truth is that he was going to do everything possible to get over it as soon as possible. And I know this sounds very cruel on SpongeBob's part, but he made it clear to us at the end of the episode. Here he was saying his final goodbye to Gary, so that afterwards he could get over it and move on with his life.
I have to try to forget Gary. Don't just stand there staring at me. Say something. I'm talking to a poster.
He might want to have another pet, maybe another snail, and who knows if SpongeBob would like it. Since he was probably frustrated with Gary, he would be complaining that the new pet wasn't like Gary, or that Gary used to do this, Gary used to rub his feet, and so on. So maybe he could have had a pet rock like Patrick did, but of course SpongeBob would get bored. We also thought he might have tried the same thing that happened in the episode when he tried to have a pet worm. But we already know what happened here. Most likely Bob would now be completely alone. Or he would find some kind of sea pet, one that doesn't move much and only needs to be fed to stay alive. And then he would continue his life as always, doing what he always does. Honestly, I do see this as very possible. Friends, the times when he interacts with Gary are very few. And when we've seen Gary on screen, he's doing his own thing, while Bob is off doing his nonsense. But now let's get to the most important part, the one that's going to blow our minds. What would have happened to Gary? First, let's start by looking at and analyzing the grandmother, the sister of the hit woman grandmother. Well, not exactly. I think the first time we saw this episode, we thought this grandmother ate the snails after fattening them up. But almost 20 years after it was released, I'm realizing that this grandmother didn't have bad intentions with Gary. Actually, she was just going to kill him. With love. The 15 snails she had before each met a different fate. Some possibly ran away, like what happened with the real Miss Tootsie. Hadn't you ever thought about it? This other snail was already inside Grandma's house before Gary arrived, but it managed to escape just in time, and that's how Grandma met Gary. Other snails may have died of old age and others from illness, similar to what would happen to Gary, you'll see. This grandma just wanted to spoil her snails, giving them desserts and very fattening foods. Maybe like she once did with her grandchildren, or maybe she never had grandchildren either. And possibly her children left her very quickly when she started to get obsessed with the snails. The truth is, this grandma has a very sad story. The thing is, she just kept feeding them because she thought that was the way to show them how much she loved them. And truthfully, there's nothing wrong with that, friends. There are many times in life when people want to do something good for other people or even pets, and they end up hurting them. A very clear example is with cats. There are foods that are very commercial, but in reality they harm them a lot and even end up causing them serious illnesses. I don't think the owners do this with that intention. And it's the same thing that would happen to Gary, but actually here we have two alternatives. Gary wouldn't have escaped from his grandmother's house, or he would have just run away and not come back. With SpongeBob, either because he never saw the signs and thought that Bob still didn't love him. First, let's see what would have happened to Gary if he had stayed at his grandmother's house. Well, the truth is that in a very short time, Gary started to gain a lot of weight. Every day he ate pancakes, ham and eggs, cookies, and all the typical foods that grandmothers give you so you'll be nice and chubby. In about 2 or 3 days, Gary broke his shell because he was already so fat. And as we saw with the other shells that Grandma had stored in her closet, the same thing happened to other snails too. So I think maybe in about 2 or 3 more weeks, with this kind of food, Gary was going to collapse, maybe have heart problems, or he might not even be able to crawl anymore from being so fat. Let's just say Gary was only going to move a few meters. And from there, he was just going to stay and wait for his death. That's right, Gary would have died from being overweight, and the other alternative would have been just as tormenting for Gary. Let's say he escaped and ran away and managed to get away from his grandmother. First of all, Gary already had his first contact with street snails. And we could see that he is very fearful, since he has spent his whole life at home and doesn't know anything about the street. In fact, we also saw that he's not good at all at getting food for himself. Since when Bob spent the 10 days trying to do the Dirty Bobble Challenge, the only thing Gary ate was just sand. So here, Gary would possibly starve to death, since after what happened with Grandma, I don't think he would trust anyone else again. The big question is, how long would Gary last without eating? Taking into account that Gary is a sea snail, it's most likely that he would last several weeks without eating before dying. They store their food very well to be able to save energy and survive. And well, since he got pretty full from all the food his grandma gave him, we estimate he has about 3 to 4 weeks before he dies of hunger. That's right, friends. So we should all be happy that Gary did come back home. Otherwise, I think this episode of SpongeBob would have turned into a lost episode or creepypasta. What else do you think would have happened to Gary and SpongeBob if he hadn't come back home? We'll read your comments.